Sekiro is the latest game from Software. It is by the people who made Demon's Souls, Dark Souls 3, Bloodborne and Drei. They do have an amazing track record. It's incredible that after all this time, they have not made a single bad game. Nope, not one. The question then isn't the quality, the question isn't, will this From Software game be good? The question is more, is this From Software game going to be great? Sekiro departs from the usual From Software staples by removing the stamina mechanic in favour of a posture bar and streamlining many of the RPG mechanics such as the traditional levelling up system, which now operates to only level up health or attack, and limiting the game to one set of armour and one weapon. There is no multiplayer, or character customization, and it's not called Dark Souls 4, while industry giants continue to produce games labouring under the same title with only minor changes to the core mechanics. From Software is quite content to create new titles. Dark Souls spawned an entirely new genre, and when they've just hit the big time with industry success, they announce a new title with an obscure Japanese name. It strips out the concepts that define their games for a game with a set protagonist and comprehensible story. Its name is Drei. Is Sekiro. The game follows the unnamed shinobi as he attempts to rescue his lord who has been captured by the Ashina clan. This plot should be fairly familiar to anyone who's touched a game before. Your princess is at the other castle. The main character, Sekiro, is voiced this time by Noshir Delal, or Daisuke Namikawa, if you're a purist sub-weeb. Sekiro has a stronger emphasis on narrative than any other From Software titles, and features a story that is understandable to laymen like me, without cliff notes, which has clear motivations to set the game in motion. The setting is no longer medieval or gothic. It's 16th century Sengoku Japan. But is this departure a good thing? Has From's freedom to adapt and recreate their brand allowed them to create something great? Combat has been a defining feature of the Souls franchise, not because it's deeply nuanced or complex, not because it requires you to do an SAT in astrophysics, not because it requires you to memorize an entire book of formulas. It's defining because it's rewarding. You're given a minimal control scheme to use, and you have to use these tools to overcome the increasingly difficult challenges. It's not up to the game to give you new abilities to allow you to progress. It's up to you, as a player, to evolve to win. It's about player skill, mechanical skill, and transferable skills. Being able to parry any opponent with ease, as an example. Well, not always. It is a testament to the design that people are playing the game without leveling up, with ceased ring, with no armor, no weapons, no equipment, deliberately gimping themselves in fights. Well, this shows two things. People have way too much time on their hands, and two, the game is not designed around artificially inflated difficulty, such as health, leveling up, or equipment, because what gets better isn't any of that, it's you. While Dark Souls isn't always perfect, it is still outstanding in its field. You can master Dark Souls, and mastery is, so satisfying. It's like learning an instrument, or learning how to dance, like learning how to approach a female. It takes a while to develop your skills. At the start you'll be terrible, but by the end, it will play itself. It's the type of reward that really makes it fun to play repeatedly. Sekiro has kept the same formula, with some marked adjustments. For one thing, the stamina bar is gone. In Dark Souls, whenever an extraneous action was performed, such as running or attacking, it would drain your stamina bar, which would replenish when no such actions were being performed. Stamina is gone, baby! No more big boned schoolboys trying to do the 100-meter dash and collapsing in a panting heap at the 10-meter mark. No more fretting about a charged attack leaving you defenseless. The player can spam R1 forever. At first this might appear to make the game less difficult, get to flee a fight whenever you want, attack whenever you want, defend whenever you want, but this game is for hardcore gamers with a 3 as the E. That's how shit serious we are, we gamers. We now have the posture bar to supplement the stamina bar. Whenever the player blocks an attack, it will drain the player's posture bar, unless they perform a perfect deflect. By blocking the second, the move would have struck, in which case they lose little to none. Posture will replenish over time, especially when out of combat, and will drop considerably after a death blow, and whilst holding L1. The lower the player's health, the slower their posture bar will deplete. This applies to the enemy, who also has a posture bar of their own. When the player's posture bar is filled, the character is staggered. Sekiro is unable to perform any action for a moment, but when the enemy posture bar is filled, Sekiro can perform a sick-as rad-bra death blow on them, which will instantly take off a bar of health, regardless of the amount of health they currently had. This creates engaging interplay between the player and the AI as the player tries to maintain their health and posture whilst trying to raise the enemies. It's a nuanced system that never gets boring. Against tougher opponents, the posture bar works effectively. Locking swords with enemies with incredibly long, hard-to-remember names is satisfying. There's good feedback to a perfect block. Death blows are nice to perform. Each encounter has flow, and the player is required to constantly be thinking and strategizing on what to do. There's a perfect system of risk and reward present. Do you stay in range of an enemy to have the chance to pull off a perfect parry, thus raising their posture? Sword-on-sword encounters are mint. But against larger enemies, the system stops working as intended. Large enemies like the Guardian Ape perform incredibly damaging attacks, but blocking them yields little reward. As aforementioned, posture recovery is tied to health, and for large enemies like the Giant Ape, the posture bar is hard to fill because the health is hard to take off. And often the posture bar will deplete before it can be taken advantage of. So instead, the player is required to lower the boss's health so that its posture will replenish slower, but the threshold of health required on larger enemies is fucking ridiculous. By the time posture becomes relevant, the enemy is 4 years dead. This actively disincentivizes blocking and parrying and posture management in these fights. Why risk perfect parries when your reward is made redundant in seconds? Against a Shin, Sword Saint, if you play perfectly, you can constantly raise his posture bar and get a death blow without taking any of his health. To do this, you need to stay close and be aggressive. You also need Doritos, Mountain Dew, pro gamer glasses, hours and hours of time, and no life. But provided you have all those things, it is possible to raise the posture bar. Alternatively, you can play safer. Step back, hit him a couple of times so that his posture will recover slower, and then start on his posture bar. But with the Guardian Ape, this is made nigh impossible. He retreats from you and his posture quickly recovers. Fine. Do damage to his health bar then, to slow his posture recovery. But doing this amount of damage takes forever, and then why not just kill him? Trying to raise the ape's posture with perfect blocks is pointless risk, like sex without a condom. Always use protection, kids. That's your friendly neighborhood suggestion. And so, it is safe to ignore posture in these fights. But without the posture bar, the nuance and complexity of the system and the combat is removed. Without stamina, and aided by Sekiro's added mobility, there is no recourse to exploiting the AI's pathing for easily avoidable attacks. Run away, wait for highly telegraphed, easily punishable jump attacks, run away again. The most egregious example is the first corrupted monk fight. I'm not sure what killed me first, the monk or old age. Without prosthetics or sword arts or items, it's a tedious battle, bereft of any challenge. The old monk's posture bar instantly replenishes, and it has moves that allow it to retreat to a safe distance to recover. Oh, and it blocks most hits, so the most attacks it will take is 2 before it blocks or retreats. The battle comes down to slowly whittling down its ginormous health bar by baiting an attack and running away. Now, blocking is possible, but when its posture bar is bigger than its health bar, and it replenishes so quickly until you hit a certain threshold on the boss's health, it's more expedient to ignore the posture bar entirely. Tedious would be the word to describe the fight. If the player is hit once, then they take a hideous amount of damage, and upon retreating to heal, the boss will recover its posture. So, while the posture bar creates a satisfying push and pull mechanic, it is not always implemented in the best way, and when it isn't, the combat can be stale, overly protective, and a bit tedious. Now, it is worth noting that this is a tiny portion of the overall game. A couple of bad bosses, or bosses that didn't particularly jive with me, don't ruin a good game, but it does detract from the experience. There's also the health bar, a fairly well-known mechanic, unless you've been hiding from the government in some cave in the Middle East for the past 40 years. Whenever you're hit by an attack, shish kebabbed by a sword, crushed, when you fall from a great height or plummet off the cliff with a drop distance of the Grand Canyon, you lose a bit of health, and when the bar fully depletes, you die. You can replenish this bar with one of a number of consumable healing items, but the most common is the Healing Gourd, a limited use item that replenishes its uses each time you die or have a little nap. Sekiro's healing system remains as balanced as ever, whilst retaining some elements of Dark Souls 2. Yes, that game had one good... No, I lied. One thing that could have worked but sucked, but we're not getting into that. Sekiro's healing system remains as balanced as ever, whilst retaining some elements from Demon Souls, with more healing items at your possession, like the pellets, which are limited in quantity you can carry per life, and heal only a small amount over time. Furthermore, the player is discouraged from popping these pills like mad because these items do not replenish on death. They have to be bought or farmed. It's so tedious, so they can't be spammed or abused endlessly without the player having to dedicate time to refilling the pot. This is arguably the best healing system a Souls-style game has had yet. The non-replenishable items create decisions and add spice to the game. Hold your applause. Pellets can't be spammed, so the player has to make hard choices on how and when to use them, which adds complexity to an already complex combat system. The Healing Gourd system, however, is complete shit. Dark Souls would assign a player 5 or 10 Estus, or healing gourds if you're to put it in Sekiro terms, to get through an area. This number was immutable unless you sacrificed humanity, another limited form of healing item, in which case the player could boost the number of Estus up to 15. This was not a perfect system by any means, but it was far better than what we currently have. The healing gourd system in Sekiro is feast or famine. I either had far too much healing and steamrolled a level, or far too little and was forced to play timidly and shy due to my lack of health. The perfect example is Mount Congo. I ran out of healing and decided to persist, but with no health I was forced to stay out of range of attacks and avoided conflict. Thus I never, ever attempted to parry the monks, ever. I did not fight like a man, I will confess that to you. I exploited them. I abused the AI. I did anything I had to do in order to avoid actually fighting, the core mechanic in this game. Shinobis are supposed to fight using every tool available, but is AI exploitation considered a shinobi tool? Now, some of you might be saying, this was a higher level area. You were told at the door that you should not enter. It is your fault this happened. You should have rested and come back. This is not a design flaw. This is a personal problem. Thank you, random commenter. The reason this is a problem is that it inhibits players from exploring new areas with some arbitrary level cap, which is what the healing system, the gourd system, is, effectively. It's an increase in a number which, when higher, makes encounters easier for the player, just like leveling up. The Dark Souls Estus system was fine. It allowed the player to progress while never feeling prohibitive, which encouraged exploration. Sekiro is quite the opposite. You have a few possible directions you can go, but the player is encouraged to follow a certain path because otherwise the player has insufficient healing items. Higher level areas will have enemies that do more damage, thus a necessity for more healing, and yet unless the player has followed a specific path, they won't have enough healing. On the contrary, let's look at the first split path in Dark Souls. The player can go to the Undead Burg, or they can go to Bone Town, named aptly for the amount of times you will get boned whilst attempting to traverse the area. I could go to Bone Town first, if I wanted, and yet I could get far into the area because I had adequate healing items to get me there. If I only had one Estus, I wouldn't make it further than the staircase without needing to retreat, and that's what the Gourd Seed system does. It stops you at the staircase. Making an area difficult is achieved in this case by giving the player inadequate healing items. New Game Plus is fantastic and I would highly recommend it, but what isn't great is giving new players new to Sekiro or... Sekiro? What the fuck is a Sekiro? Is that a new Japanese word or is that just Warg for something? New to Sekiro or to Souls games. Such limited healing items, thus giving new players very little opportunity to make mistakes before they're killed. Enemy health remains much the same as in other games with the exception of the death blow mechanic. Enemies now have health bars represented by these small red dots, and each time a health bar or posture bar is depleted, Sekiro can perform a death blow which will activate the next health bar. Repeat until dead. It is the fairest system thus far, rather than relying on visual or audible cues to know when a boss is entering its second phase. It is now made apparent by the health bars. When one is depleted, they'll enter another phase with extra moves in their moveset, but Sekiro suffers from this cycle of escalation that has plagued the series. Like nuclear disarmament, they keep trying to raise the bar by one-upping the other country. Sekiro tries to raise the difficulty on bosses by giving them 13 different phases.
Back in my day, we used to have one-phase bosses. Once the player mastered that phase, they mastered the whole boss.
This does not exist in Sekiro. Multiple phase bosses used to be an exception to rule, but now they have become the rule. In the past, multiple phase bosses were special, and second phases were moments to be admired. This is no longer the case when every boss has multiple phases. At this point, it's expected, which takes all the specialness out of it. Okay. Real talk, let's address the terrorist on the plane. In text-based porn games, the AI doesn't matter, but in Sekiro, which is entirely built around encounters with the opponent, good AI is a must. And good AI has never really been From's thing. AI in this game is highly exploitable. Players can circumvent the parry system entirely by just walking around the opponent, or by running into a range where the enemy will do a highly exploitable jump attack. Or the player can find loops that will lock an opponent down to a repeatable, highly exploitable pattern. I love From as much as everyone, but the AI is not amazing. A beautiful woman can fart, and I can acknowledge the potency of its smell while still appreciating her as a person. Combat is significantly easier because of exploitable AI, which is disappointing to say the least. Now, please, before you flood me with messages saying, "Bitch, you couldn't create better AI," well, I know. That's why I don't design game AI. But I can still comment on it because I can still know good and bad AI as a consumer of the medium of games. The AI in From games isn't terrible, it's just sufficient. The AI pathing is usually fine, the AI can navigate environments without noticeable problems. I've only seen one example where the pathing broke and this monster started moonwalking like it was Michael Jackson. That being said, it is easy to exploit the AI's pathing. If you walk to a certain spot, the AI will hit an invisible wall and oftentimes will return to its designated area, like a dog on a leash. This can be used to exploit the AI for a free backstab. I watched a friend play the game, and he aggroed this interior ministry ninja. God damn, that's a mouthful. Then he proceeded to run away from the interior ministry ninja. and when he came back, it had de-aggroed, and he snuck around and backstabbed it. The same can be done to Juzo the Drunkard, and many AI in this game. There are times when the AI will really shine by employing intelligent tactics to surround the player, like the monkeys at this part here. But I wish they use these features more. A lot of the time the AI is static and rigid in its ways. They have a predetermined moveset, and they're inflexible. I can only hope that they can include more dynamic enemies in the future, like Owl Father and Owl being able to Mikiri counter, and a Shin changing one of his attacks based on the player's reactions. These touches elevated the AI above being mere mindless drones to perform moves, and made them feel a lot more real and engaging to fight. Breaking the AI's pathing to get a backstab, exploiting the enemy's inability to hit a moving target, baiting out jump attacks, the player can actually adopt an entirely different playstyle by abusing the AI, which at least gives the game a second playstyle, which is lacking in Sekiro. I only ask that the AI be tightened up, more intelligent, less exploitable, and have it interact with the player more. Prosthetics are a new addition. They're an item that sits in the player's inventory. That's the only use I've found for them. The reason that they're not used a lot is because of how the developers have designed the prosthetics and prosthetic system. Each prosthetic has a different application, but these applications are niche. Armor stripping, for example. Armor stripping is used on this. See this? When it looks like they're not even wearing armor, that's when it's used. Some prosthetics have more uses, or serve a secondary function, but they're too weak to be used for anything other than their primary function. The damage output is too low, the speed is too slow to be used practically. There are many downsides and not enough upside. Why would I spend forever trying to use this axe to raise posture damage, when I can do that far more expediently by simply playing as I always have, hitting R1 and occasionally L1. If the prosthetics were more powerful, they would be used a lot more. All the time, perhaps. The Spirit Emblem system also inhibits the use of prosthetics. Each action with a prosthetic requires a Spirit Emblem, a currency that regenerates from the player's stock upon death or resting, and this stock is not infinite. The player has to replenish it by buying more emblems with gold. More emblems can be found around the world, but the player is limited to 15, initially. And the world, the system works okay. There are enough emblems granted to the player, either in the world or from defeating enemies, that I found I was never out of emblems. Boss fights is where the system fails. With the exception of Madame Butterfly, there is no boss that regenerates a player's spirit emblems. If there was, I imagine the firecracker spam would be quite a spectacle to behold. It would be like the goddamn 4th of July. But you know something amazing? There is more than firecrackers. Yes, I too am shocked. The reason this is the case is because, as I said, these prosthetics are too situational or weak to be used outside of specific circumstances. And worse than that, they cost way too much. Yes, 3 spirit emblems is too much to pay for the ability to turn people around. You would have to pay me for me to use that shitty prosthetic. Yet the player has to draw from the pool of spirit emblems, which is also used for combat arts, as we will discuss later, to use an ability that is oftentimes useless or too niche to be applied. So here is my proposal, to make the prosthetic system fit into the gameplay loop better. Abandon the Spirit Emblem system. Yes, how could I suggest that we take Spirit Emblems out? Because, you know, the firecrackers are overpowered as is. Well, here is my solution to that problem. Humble, not designer of the game. Prosthetics should cost no Spirit Emblems, but they should do posture damage to the player. The entire game is about managing posture, so this implementation would fit the combat loop. Some examples. Using the firecrackers, which is the one that I'm sure everyone's most worried about, should fill the player's posture bar to full, and perhaps the regeneration of posture from that point for a short period could be tweaked so that using firecrackers would slow down posture recovery. If the player used firecrackers at higher posture, the posture bar would break, and the player would also be temporarily stunned. as happens when the posture bar breaks. This would avoid the problem of having the player relentlessly spam firecrackers, and it creates an interesting dilemma. The player can use the firecrackers to get in a free couple of hits, but then their posture would be in a bad place, and they would be unable to block. They would have to perform consecutive perfect riposts or get wrecked son. And if they chose to run away, their posture would continue to recover slower. Slower because posture lowers quicker whilst blocking. Here is another couple of examples. Divine Abduction would raise the posture bar about above the halfway mark with its startup move, and the second move would fill half of the posture bar. So, in theory, if a player tried to use a Divine Abduction instantly, they would be staggered. So the player would have to wait a second to trigger it. It would be useful while not being too overpowered by, the Mount Congo Temple, but fuck that place. And players could find times to perfect the use of the prosthetic. The Great Raven Feather would fully raise the posture bar and keep it there until the player triggered its ability. So whilst being very powerful, it also leaves the player vulnerable. Some other prosthetics would require significant tweaks to fit into the system and fit logically within the realism of the world. Like, throwing a shuriken shouldn't knock you out. I mean, Sekiro is not that unco. So maybe it would just do a little bit of posture damage, and it would take a bit more to charge up. And it would do no damage, or only a tiny bit of damage. So the main thing you'd use the shurikens for would be to interrupt combos and knock opponents out of the air. And opponents with hyper armor would be largely immune to the effect. Or we could talk about the stylish umbrella, which could be used as a hyper-defensive tool that could protect the player against attacks, but would not do any posture damage to the opponent. It would take significant time to set up and stop using so that the player would have to find opportunities to use it. Imagine, if the player could rely on their prosthetics, rather than having to gamble away spirit emblems like they've been at the pokies all day, the player could create playstyles that could evolve around the use of prosthetics. Players who like defensive gameplay can use the umbrella, those with a mouse cam and the sponsorships, could play hyper-aggressive perfect play, firecracker speedruns. The prosthetic system was a chance to give Sekiro variety and complexity, and instead, I may as well use an Atari controller, because the game encourages the player to press 2 buttons total, L1 and R1. The Spirit Emblem system also prohibits the combat arts. When an attack is repeatedly spammable, like L1 or R1, it is imperative to designers that the balance is correct, because if spammable buttons are too powerful, then the game becomes a farce. When a move isn't spammable, the same concern isn't as integral. I understand that they do still try to balance each move regardless of emblems, making some of them shit regardless of how many spirit emblems they cost, but the existence of emblems creates a crutch for lazy design. The developers can create moves that the AI is incapable of dealing with, and leave it like that because the spirit emblem system stops it from becoming a larger problem. If the developers had no spirit emblems, they would be forced to create combat arts that the AI can appropriately deal with, so that the game could not be broken. These fantastic moves are already present in the game. The Ichimonji is one of these examples. It's a move that takes time to wind up, and the enemy can block it or interrupt it. But in return, if the player can land the hit, they do a large amount of posture damage and stagger the opponent. Having this ability be infinite means that the player always has this move as an option in combat, which adds another move to the player's arsenal. Combat would be vastly more interesting if there were more moves like this that could be repeatedly used. My suggestion then is remove the restrictions imposed by spirit emblems, balance the moves around the enemies, and the game's combat becomes far more varied in terms of options in combat. As it currently stands, combat is a bit more limited in this game, and combat arts and prosthetics are prohibitive and will only be used by a very niche portion of the community, rather than fleshing out the system like they could have done. This lack of combat variety hurts the longevity of the game. The game only has one reliable weapon, a katana, and one playstyle, aggression. The lack of playstyle options has proven not to be a huge problem in the past. Bloodborne is limited to aggression, but I would argue it has the best combat out of all the Soulsborne games. What hurts Sekiro is its lack of variety in combat. There's one weapon. The player can press R1 to slash or hold R1 for a more damaging attack. Then there's L1, which can be used to riposte. R1 and L1 can be pressed simultaneously for combat arts. And that's it. Oh, I guess there's L2 for prosthetics. I suppose. In other Souls games, there were soft class systems. Players could invest in magic or create a more defensive playstyle or have a lighter build. Each playstyle had a distinct feeling to it and changed the way the player could play the game. Sekiro has a permanent light build. The RPG mechanics that help define different playstyles is gone, but even Bloodborne had a variety of different weapons that could vary how the game played. Sekiro has a sword. Prosthetics and combat arts could have fixed this problem, but instead they're fiddly to use, inorganic in combat, largely ineffective, and they're resource-based, which means that the player cannot rely on them for repeated use. So despite how gorgeous the combat is, and I do love it immensely, it isn't as deep or engaging as previous entries. And if From does another Sekiro game, I hope that they abandon the emblem system and focus on balancing the prosthetics to work within the existing systems. My solution is by no means perfect. I don't pretend to be a designer, but this is the problem I see that is plaguing the game. The game lacks a certain lure that previous titles had. I don't feel like coming back to play it now that I've finished it twice. I've upgraded my prosthetic tree to max through extensive grinding, but I'm not sure why I did it. There is no multiplayer component. I can't flaunt my skill or lack thereof to other players. There's not any real class system, and prosthetics are a weak substitution. There's just no reason to come back unless you're a completionist, or you have to produce content for it, or you just really love the combat like I do. But the fact that it's not infinitely replayable is absolutely fine. This isn't Dark Souls. This game is trying to do something different. It's about telling the story of the man called Sekiro. It's self-contained. It has a satisfying conclusion. It has different goals to Dark Souls. That being said, I wouldn't mind a deeper RPG system. One that's less grindy and preferably less boring. It could have made repeat playthroughs more dynamic for each player, and it could have helped carve out greater variation in playstyles. There are some other missed opportunities that I feel obligated to point out. The player can enter memories, and each boss drops a memory, but the boss memories only level up the player. So there was a great opportunity to create a boss rush mode, where the player could revisit memories and revisit bosses and fight them again. And honestly, the bosses are the best part of the game, and I would love to death to be beaten by a Shin all day, every day. I would love to be able to fight them again without having to complete the entire game. For those saying that this might not fit thematically into the world, well, it could easily. There are workarounds. You can have the bosses drop a bell when they die. That could be the solution. And on a little side note, what the fuck? This is probably the first invisible wall in From Software history, and there was no reason for it to be here. They could have had dry land or a dock or something. What is this? I don't understand. It's not a big thing, but it irks me. Why? Why is there an invisible wall here? With all that I've said, it is easy to get the impression that I hate the game. No. This is the most fun I have had since probably Bloodborne in 2015. The environmental storytelling is fantastic, the attention to detail is good as ever, the game has amazing art direction, authenticity, branching paths, creative enemy design, a good soundtrack, good cutscenes, characterization, great voice acting, including the English dub, you weebs, and most amazing yet, in 2019, From Software finally made NPCs that have moving lips. That is perhaps the biggest thing to take from Sekiro. Better than all of this, From Software has shown a willingness as a company to grow. Sekiro departed from many of the tropes that made it a household icon like the stamina bar and the RPG system so that they could create a different, more personal experience. Sekiro has clear goals and motivations, and he's a strongly developed character. The only place I feel that the game let up was parts of the combat. While the core combat is refined and deeply satisfying, don't get me wrong, I've shit on it a lot, but it has the best fights in any From Software game, and it is so satisfying. It also has some disappointing aspects that, if corrected, could make it a really, really great game. So is it a great game? Yeah, not quite. If they fixed the exploitable AI, redid the combat art and prosthetic system, abandoned spirit emblems, rebalanced certain fights, not naming any specific fights, old monk, so that the posture bar played more of a role in the fight, removed some of the egregious examples of one-shot found throughout the game, gave the RPG systems more mechanical depth, and removed the shitty gourd system in favour of the old Estus system, the game would be vastly improved. Feel free to contend them in the comments below. I understand some people may not agree with me. But when you really look at it, those aren't really huge problems that I've stated. So what is truly holding the game back? Well, it's this. 2 out of 10.